Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a topic that affects millions of people, and it's undergoing this quiet but, profound revolution, how we understand, categorize, and ultimately treat mental disorders.
Yeah, it's a really significant shift happening.
We've sourced some truly insightful material for you, including excerpts from a powerful piece called The Harmful Folly of Categorical Psychiatry. So our mission today is really to uncover why the traditional way of diagnosing mental illness has faced such significant challenges.
Right.
And then explore this groundbreaking new framework that's really, changing the game.
It's a fascinating shift, really, because this new perspective, it doesn't just tweak existing ideas, it fundamentally challenges decades of thinking. We're talking about moving beyond these sort of rigid labels to dynamic, interconnected systems. And that has massive implications for how we treat and even maybe how we might prevent mental illness down the line.
Okay, let's unpack this then. For a very long time, the dominant model for mental disorders has been what we call a categorical one. It's kind of epitomized by the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
The standard guide, basically.
Exactly.
Right.
You can think of it almost like a checklist of symptoms, and the underlying assumption, maybe implicit, has often been that each disorder is a distinct, separate disease entity, kind of like how a specific infection causes a specific fever.
Yeah, a neat box for everything. And while that traditional paradigm has certainly given us a common language, which is useful for communication,
Sure, yeah.
it has really struggled with several well-documented limitations when you actually put it into practice. The cracks have definitely started to show.
And one of the most striking issues, I think, is something called comorbidity.
Right. Big one.
In the real world, it's incredibly common for people to meet the criteria for multiple diagnoses at the same time. And we're not talking about a rare occurrence here, are we?
Not at all. Epidemiological surveys consistently show that many patients receive 3, 4, or sometimes even more labels concurrently. It's the norm, not the exception, in many clinical settings.
Which immediately raises a pretty fundamental question, right?
Absolutely. If, say, major depression and generalized anxiety disorder are truly independent diseases, why do they so frequently appear together in the same person? There was a significant study looked at, I think, 34,000 patients, and it found basically no sharp boundaries between 12 major DSM diagnoses.
Wow. No sharp boundaries.
Yeah. Instead, the symptoms form this kind of interconnected web, which really suggests our current categories might be slicing nature in ways that don't quite reflect the underlying reality.
Slicing nature at the wrong joints, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, yeah.
And then on the flip side, you see this enormous variety within the same diagnosis.
Oh, definitely. Heterogeneity.
Yeah, take major depression again. Two people could both meet the DSM criteria, yet share maybe only one symptom in common.
It's possible, mathematically.
Right. One might have insomnia, weight loss,
Oh.
intense guilt. The other experiences hypersomnia, so sleeping too much, weight gain, and that kind of psychomotor slowing, feeling sluggish.
They get the exact same label, major depressive disorder.
But their lived experiences are vastly, profoundly different.
Exactly. And that's because the DSM uses what are called polythetic criteria. And what that means, essentially, is there are literally thousands of possible symptom combinations that can lead to the diagnosis of depression.
Nelson.
Yeah. Clinically, this heterogeneity is, it's glaring. Knowing a patient's diagnosis often tells us surprisingly little about their specific experience or, crucially, what the most effective treatment for that specific individual might be. It's a huge barrier to truly personalized care.
Okay, so this leads us to maybe a bit of a logical trap.
You could say that.
The categorical system can inadvertently encourage what's called reification fallacy. Can you explain that?
Sure. It's basically treating abstract categories, these diagnostic labels, as if they were tangible, real, underlying diseases. So we hear phrases like, her depression caused her to withdraw socially. But wait a second.
Right, hang on.
Depression is defined by a cluster of symptoms, and social withdrawal is often one of those defining symptoms.
So you're saying the definition includes the thing it supposedly causes.
Exactly. It's like saying, he's sad because he has sadness. It's a circular argument, a tautology.
Right.
These psychiatric diagnoses, as they stand now, are descriptive labels for symptom clusters. They're not, in most cases, proven causal entities in the way a virus causes the flu. And this framework can actually divert our attention from the actual biological, psychological, and social processes that are truly generating and sustaining the symptoms. We end up mistaking the map for the territory,
Yeah, that makes sense. And perhaps the most significant practical weakness, thinking about clinicians and patients, is the poor predictive power of these diagnoses.
That's a big one.
In other areas of medicine, right, a good diagnosis should offer strong indication of prognosis, or which treatment is likely to work. Like you mentioned, a specific cancer subtype predicting response to chemotherapy.
A very clear example.
But DSM diagnoses largely fail on that front. As Thomas Insel, the former director of the NIMH, pointed out, they're based on a consensus about clusters of clinical symptoms, not any objective measure.
Right. They're reliable in the sense that different clinicians often agree on the label, but not necessarily valid in terms of pointing to underlying mechanisms or predicting outcomes. That's why the DSM has sometimes been called a dictionary rather than a scientific taxonomy.
The dictionary, huh?
Yeah. A symptom-based diagnosis rarely tells a clinician definitively what the best treatment choice is because, as we said, two patients with the same label might respond to entirely different interventions.
And this fundamental limitation has actually prompted these major efforts, like the NIH's RDOC initiative.
Exactly. The Research Domain Criteria Project. It's a direct response to this problem, trying to define mental disorders based on observable behaviors and neurobiological measures, looking across traditional diagnostic boundaries, rather than relying solely on those symptom clusters.
Okay, so another problem. How these diagnoses can lead to sort of rigid, one-size-fits-all treatment protocols.
Yeah, the cookbook approach.
Right. If someone gets labeled with schizophrenia, the treatment might rigidly emphasize antipsychotics almost automatically. Even if, for that specific person, their most debilitating problems are actually severe social anxiety or chronic insomnia, which might need different approaches. The label tends to dictate the primary approach.
And this approach offers very little guidance for that comorbidity issue we talked about earlier.
Ah, yeah, the overlaps.
Those co-occurring issues can get undertreated or even completely overlooked because the focus is on the main label. Complex presentations might get forced into the closest fitting DSM category, which can lead to outright misdiagnosis.
Forcing a square peg into a round hole.
Pretty much. The categorical model's rigidity often hinders effective care by prioritizing a neat label over understanding the actual unique symptom network a patient is experiencing.
And finally, there's the impact of the label itself. The simple act of assigning a psychiatric label can have profound, sometimes unintended, harmful consequences.
Absolutely. Stigma is a huge factor.
Diagnoses carry significant social stigma, but also self-stigma, right?
Definitely. Being told one has schizophrenia or is bipolar can trigger these deeply ingrained stereotypes of being fundamentally broken or permanently impaired.
Yeah, that sounds heavy.
And research consistently shows this can lead to people internalizing those negative stereotypes, feeling shame, withdrawing from society. While a label can, for some, offer a sense of relief or validation, finally having a name for their suffering.
Right, that happens too.
For many others, it can pigeonhole individuals, invite discrimination, and tragically cause people to start seeing themselves as the disorder rather than as a person experiencing a difficult state. That can really crush hope for change.
Okay, so we've laid out quite a few significant issues with the traditional model. If that's the case, what's the alternative? What's emerging as a more powerful paradigm?
Well, what's truly exciting and gaining a lot of traction is the rise of the networked systems model of psychopathology.
Network systems.
Okay. At its core, this approach suggests we stop imagining mental disorders as these fixed categories or hidden underlying diseases. Instead, we understand them as dynamic constellations of causally interacting symptoms.
So the symptoms interact with each other.
Precisely. The symptoms aren't just passive reflections of some hidden disease. They actively interact and reinforce one another. They create feedback loops that can stabilize into a pathological state.
Wow, okay. That philosophical shift feels profound. Instead of saying disorder X causes symptoms A, B, and C,
right,
the network model proposes that having symptoms A, B, and C constitutes disorder X, precisely because those symptoms form a self-sustaining interlocked network. Is that right?
You've got it. There's no separate X apart from that pattern of interrelations.
Can you give an analogy, maybe?
Sure. Think of it like a traffic jam. The jam isn't some separate entity causing cars to stop. It emerges from the dynamic interactions of thousands of individual cars slowing down, braking, changing lanes.
Okay. Or like a hurricane.
Or a hurricane forming from complex, interacting weather variables, temperature, pressure, wind. The disorder isn't some invisible thing behind the symptoms. It is the very structure and behavior of the network formed by those symptoms. A helpful metaphor from dynamical systems theory is the idea of an attractor, a stable pattern that a system tends to settle into.
An attractor.
Yeah. For instance, low mood might lead someone to withdraw socially, which then leads to feelings of loneliness, which further lowers their mood, pulling the whole system into a depressive attractor state.
Okay, so causality isn't from one single root cause. It's spread across the network.
Exactly. Causality is distributed. So insomnia might worsen fatigue, which then deepens a depressed mood, which might make it harder to get out of bed, reinforcing the fatigue. You get these vicious cycles.
Right.
And within these networks, different symptoms can play different roles. Some might be highly influential hubs, like major intersections in that traffic jam analogy. Addressing those could have a big ripple effect. Others might be more peripheral.
And this perspective, it doesn't assume disorders are these universal, natural kinds with a fixed essence.
Exactly. It aligns with an anti-essentialist stance. Disorders are seen as contingent patterns emerging from a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors unique to each individual and their context.
Which sounds more like how we think about complex systems generally.
It really does. It resonates with how computational neuroscientists, like Carl Friston, for example, view the brain's activity itself as complex network dynamics. And the beauty of the network concept is its flexibility. It can span multiple levels, from psychological symptom networks all the way down to neural circuits.
This sounds compelling theoretically, but a new model, it's only as good as the evidence supporting it. Is there empirical backing for this network idea?
Absolutely. That's what's really exciting. Over the past decade or so, researchers, people like Denny Borsboom, Eike Fried, and many others, have developed concrete methods to actually map these symptom networks using real patient data. It's not just theory anymore.
Mapping the networks, how does that work?
Well, one of the earliest and most significant successes of this network perspective is how elegantly it explains comorbidity, that issue of multiple diagnoses we discussed.
Right, the overlaps.
Instead of assuming separate diseases that just happen to co-occur, the network model suggests comorbidity arises when different symptom syndromes share common symptoms, or when symptoms from one syndrome directly interact with symptoms from another.
Like bridges between islands.
Exactly. They effectively merge into a larger interconnected network through what researchers call bridge symptoms.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. Major depression and generalized anxiety. They often share symptoms like sleep problems, difficulty concentrating, fatigue.
Yeah, very common overlap.
Network analyses have clearly shown these shared symptoms often serve as bridges. An episode of depression might, maybe through disrupting sleep, activate anxiety symptoms. Or high anxiety might make it hard to concentrate, feeding into depressive feelings of inadequacy.
So they trigger each other through these shared paths.
Precisely. Studies, like one by Kramer and colleagues back in 2010, found that depression and anxiety symptom networks were highly entangled, not cleanly separable entities.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense.
And the network approach actually predicted that the more symptoms two disorders share, or the more tightly their individual networks connect, the higher their observed comorbidity would be in the population.
And was that prediction borne out?
It was empirically supported again and again. Disorders that are close on a symptom network, meaning they share many DSM symptoms, indeed have higher rates of co-occurrence. This pattern just doesn't really fit the traditional conceptualization of independent, distinct diseases.
Interesting. Okay, what other evidence is there?
Another powerful insight comes from looking at symptoms not just as present or absent, but as nodes within the network.
Nodes, like connection points.
Exactly. Remember how the traditional DSM treats all symptoms as pretty much interchangeable criteria? Any 5 of 9 for depression, for instance.
Right.
But network research reveals symptoms are not interchangeable. Each one has a unique position and connectivity within the network, and that really matters clinically.
How so?
Well, studies on depression networks, for example, have frequently found that core symptoms like depressed mood itself and anhedonia, that loss of interest or pleasure,
Hmm.
those often sit at highly connected central positions within the network. They act like powerful hubs capable of triggering cascades of other symptoms.
While other symptoms might be less influential.
Potentially, yes. Other symptoms like maybe changes in appetite or weight might be more peripheral in some individuals' networks. We can quantify the centrality of a symptom, how much influence it has within that specific network structure.
And what's compelling here, you mentioned, is that these mathematically central symptoms often align with what clinicians intuitively feel is core to a disorder.
That's often the case, yeah. It provides empirical support for clinical intuition. And the implication is huge. If insomnia is identified as a highly central symptom in someone's unique depression network.
Like a key log in a log jam.
Exactly. Aggressively treating that insomnia could effectively break the feedback loops that are sustaining the entire disorder.
Whereas just focusing on the depression label might miss that specific leverage point.
Precisely. The source material we looked at notes that numerous studies have suggested that targeting the most central symptoms may offer novel therapeutic strategies. For instance, targeting craving in substance use disorders might have an outsized positive effect on many other related symptoms like withdrawal or risky behaviors, because craving is often a very central node.
Okay, targeting central symptoms. What about change over time? You said networks are dynamic.
Right. If mental disorders are dynamic network states, we should be able to observe how symptom activation unfolds over time. The traditional model is largely static. You have the disorder or you don't. But the network approach actively encourages time series analysis, using things like daily diaries or smartphone apps to monitor how these systems shift and change day by day, or even hour by hour.
And this is where complexity science comes in.
Yes, this is where it gets really fascinating. Drawing from complexity science, we know that complex systems often show early warning signals before they undergo a sudden dramatic transition like shifting states.
Like that lake example you mentioned, flipping from clear to murky.
Exactly. Before that flip happens, the lake might show subtle signs like fluctuations in water clarity becoming larger or recovery from small disturbances taking longer. The network model predicts something similar for mental health.
So before a major mental breakdown or relapse,
A person's symptom network might show specific warning signs. Things like their mood becoming more unstable day to day, or symptoms becoming more tightly interconnected, meaning activation of one symptom more strongly predicts activation of others.
and is there evidence for this?
There's preliminary evidence, yes. It's an active area of research, but it's really promising.
Because the implication is prediction.
Potentially, yes. This raises an incredibly important question for the future. Could we someday predict the onset of a disorder, or a relapse, by mathematically detecting when a person's symptom network is becoming unstable and tipping towards one of these dysfunctional attractor states?
Well, that would be a game changer for prevention.
Absolutely. And temporal network analysis, looking at data over time, also helps us illuminate specific causal relations for that individual.
Right, you mentioned the unique chains.
Yeah. For one person, stress might primarily trigger rumination, which then leads to anxiety. For another, anxiety spikes might lead to insomnia, which causes fatigue, which then deepens depressed mood. We can start mapping out these individual pathways.
Which is incredibly powerful for tailoring treatment.
Hugely.
And this network idea also helps explain why relapses are so common, right? Even when someone feels better.
Yes, exactly. Even after symptoms subside and someone feels in remission, the underlying network connectivity might remain strong. Think of it like the wiring is still there, even if the lights are currently off.
Like a silent disorder state.
That's a good term for it. The system is highly connected, highly susceptible, but with low symptom activation at that moment. Then, a relatively small stressor, maybe a bad night's sleep, an argument can rapidly reignite the whole network, pushing it back into an active symptomatic state.
Which really underscores the importance of ongoing care even during remission.
Definitely. It's about maintaining network resilience, not just reducing symptoms temporarily. It highlights the need for skills and strategies to manage those underlying vulnerabilities.
Okay, so beyond just fitting the data better, a truly useful new model needs to offer real-world advantages. How does the network paradigm stack up in terms of practical benefits?
Well, it offers several clear advantages that directly address the shortcomings of the categorical model we talked about.
Such as?
First, identifying leverage points for intervention. By precisely mapping a patient's unique symptom web, this approach highlights the most effective places to intervene.
So instead of generically treating depression,
Right. Instead of just saying, okay, SSRI for depression, clinicians can target specific symptoms that are identified as central or causally pivotal within that individual's unique network.
like the insomnia example we discussed.
Exactly. If a patient's panic attacks are clearly triggered by chronic insomnia and fatigue, the network view immediately suggests that aggressively treating the insomnia could prevent the entire cascade of panic.
Something a traditional approach might miss or downplay.
Potentially. Interventions can be designed very specifically to break particular feedback loops, like targeting rumination to allow mood to recover, or addressing social isolation to boost positive reinforcement. It's much more targeted.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
What else?
Second, explaining individual heterogeneity. The network model naturally accounts for why two people with the same diagnosis can look so profoundly different.
Because their networks are different.
Precisely. Each person's symptom network is shaped by their unique combination of experiences, biology, environment, coping styles, everything. It doesn't assume a single essence of depression, but rather acknowledges that there are many different configurations of interacting symptoms that can manifest as a depressive syndrome.
So one person's depression might be mostly cognitive loops, another's more physical.
Exactly. Negative thought loops dominating one, while profound energy loss and bodily symptoms dominate another. Traditional diagnosis calls both major depressive disorder and largely shrugs at these differences in presentation.
But the network model can help explain why different treatments might work better for each.
Yes. It can suggest why cognitive therapy might be highly effective for the first patient, focusing on those thought loops, while perhaps a biological intervention or something focused on activity scheduling might be better for the second. This aligns perfectly with the goals of personalized medicine.
Got it. And third,
Clarifying why relapse and chronicity occur. We touched on this, but the network model conceptualizes disorders as these attractor states that, once formed, can actively maintain themselves. This provides a much clearer explanation for chronic courses or sudden relapses than the idea of a simple latent disease just switching on or off.
right, the silent network idea.
Yeah. In the traditional view, if a disorder is in remission, the disease is often thought of as gone. But in the network view, remission might just mean symptoms have decreased, but those critical connections between symptoms remain strong.
The vulnerability is still there.
Exactly. That liability network structure persists, and a small nudge, a new stressor, a trigger can rapidly push the system back into the symptomatic state. This deeply resonates with the experience of many patients who feel they always have to stay vigilant.
Yeah, I can see that. It also explains those sudden switches, maybe like a single panic attack spiraling quickly into full-blown panic disorder.
It can, yes. The network might already be structured in a way that's highly susceptible, and one strong activation can quickly cascade through the system and stabilize it in that panicked attractor state.
Okay. And fourth, prediction.
Improved prediction of onset and trajectory. While this is still an emerging frontier, the promise is clear. By understanding a person's precise symptom network structure and dynamics, we could potentially predict their future trajectories with far greater accuracy.
Using those early warning signals we talked about.
Potentially, yes. Those signals could flag when someone is truly approaching a tipping point, allowing for preemptive intervention before a full episode develops.
Even predicting specific symptom patterns.
Possibly. Knowing an individual's network structure might forecast more precisely what happens if a given symptom arises. In someone whose network strongly links sleep disturbance and low mood, a week of poor sleep might reliably herald a depressive episode.
Whereas in another person, it might not have that effect.
Right. Their network might be structured differently. This allows for incredibly fine-grained, personalized prediction, where traditional diagnosis often offers very little beyond general probabilities. And studies are starting to bear this out, finding that baseline network characteristics can predict treatment outcomes months later, sometimes better than just looking at the total symptom severity score.
Okay, the scientific case and the potential advantages seem really compelling. But let's talk about the flip side. Is sticking to the old way, the categorical model, really causing harm? Or is it just less than ideal?
Well, I think the argument presented in sources like The Harmful Folly is that, yes, the continued dominance of the categorical model has very tangible negative consequences. It's not just suboptimal. It can be actively harmful for patients and for the progress of mental health care overall.
Okay, how so? What are the harms?
First, misdiagnosis and oversimplification. The DSM's rigid categories can lead to outright mislabeling of complex presentations that just don't fit neatly into one box.
Right. People are messy, not neat boxes.
Exactly. Clinicians might feel pressured to squeeze a complex case, maybe someone with severe mood swings, clear traumatic stress reactions, and problematic substance use into a single primary diagnosis, like bipolar disorder or PTSD.
And miss crucial parts of the picture.
Potentially, yes. They might miss how these different problem areas are interacting. A network perspective, by contrast, would aim to chart all the significant problems and their specific links. It might reveal, for example, that insomnia and hypervigilance stemming from the trauma are actually fueling the mood instability, which in turn drives the substance use as a coping mechanism.
And getting the initial formulation wrong can set treatment off track from the start.
Absolutely. Misdiagnosis based on forcing someone into the closest fit category can lead down ineffective treatment paths. The network approach, by focusing on the whole system rather than just a single nominal label, makes misdiagnosis less likely, or at least less consequential, because you're constantly looking at the interconnected parts.
Okay, harm number 1. Misdiagnosis. What's next?
Second, rigid, label-centered treatment. We touched on this, but because categorical diagnoses often come with standard treatment algorithms assuming a pure disorder.
The cookbook approach again.
Right. They really struggle with the real-world complexity of patients who frequently present with multiple diagnoses or highly atypical symptom profiles. The traditional model often offers no systematic way to prioritize or integrate treatment for these complex cases.
Which can lead to frustration for everyone involved.
Enormous frustration. It can waste huge amounts of time, resources, and patient hope, leading to this frustrating cycle of trying one medication or therapy after another without success. And a label-focused mindset might even cause clinicians to unintentionally ignore certain symptoms because they're not considered part of the core diagnosis.
The OCD example you mentioned.
Yeah, where a patient with OCD might find their psychiatrist laser-focused on treating the compulsions, while perhaps overlooking or downplaying their debilitating panic attacks, even if those panic attacks are functionally related to the OCD triggers and avoidance. The network view keeps everything on the table.
Got it. Harm number 2, rigid treatment. Harm 3.
Stigma and the impact on patient self-concept. We've discussed the general stigma of labels, but the traditional model, perhaps unintentionally, can encourage seeing the person as their disorder.
Using terms like a schizophrenic, a borderline.
Exactly, which can be incredibly dehumanizing and can subtly, or not so subtly, reduce hope for both the patient and sometimes even the clinician.
Whereas the network model offers a different framing.
It does. When communicated effectively, it emphasizes that a disorder is a dynamic state you are currently in, not a fixed trait you are. It's a pattern of interacting elements that has become stuck, but patterns can be changed.
That feels very different.
It's profoundly different. It's much more empowering to perhaps say to a patient, it looks like you're caught in a strong depression network right now, and we can see these specific feedback loops like rumination and withdrawal feeding each other. Let's work on weakening those specific connections rather than simply saying, you have major depression, implying a fixed entity.
It focuses on changeability.
Yes, it offers a more fluid, hopeful conceptualization. It can improve the therapeutic alliance because you're working together to understand and modify a dynamic system, seeing the patient as a whole person navigating that system, not just as an embodiment of a static label.
Okay. And the final harm?
Harm number 4. Impediments to research and innovation. It's argued that the dominance of the categorical paradigm has actually stalled progress in understanding the fundamental mechanisms of mental illness.
How so?
Well, decades of intensive research efforts to find specific genes or definitive biomarkers for individual DSM disorders have yielded surprisingly little, frankly.
Despite huge investment.
Huge investment. And a major reason might be that these DSM disorders, as currently defined, are likely not biologically unitary categories. They're umbrella terms for heterogeneous groups of people.
So researchers might have been looking for things that don't really exist in that neat categorical way.
That's the argument. By reifying diagnoses, treating them as real biological entities, researchers may have been searching for essences or single causes that simply aren't there for these complex, multi-determined conditions. The network approach, however, encourages a different kind of research, much more nuanced, focusing on specific symptoms and their causal interactions, or on those transdiagnostic processes that cut across different labels.
Like inflammation and fatigue.
Exactly. Investigating how inflammation impacts fatigue across depression, anxiety, chronic fatigue syndrome, etc., rather than just looking for the inflammation marker for depression. This could significantly accelerate discoveries by focusing on measurable mechanisms linked to specific symptom dimensions, leading to better targeted trials and potentially new interventions.
Okay, so the potential harms of sticking with the old model seem quite significant across the board. Diagnosis, treatment, patient experience, and even research progress.
That's the case being made, yes.
So let's pivot to the future then. What does this all mean? If the network model is gaining ground, what could the future of mental health look like? It sounds like it opens up some really exciting possibilities.
It really does. While the network model is still relatively young, it's already stimulating fascinating new lines of inquiry and development that could profoundly reshape both clinical practice and research in the coming years.
What's one major direction?
Integration with AI and big data. The sheer complexity of individual symptom networks, especially when you track them over time, really calls for advanced analytical tools. AI and machine learning are perfectly suited for this.
How would that work?
By leveraging large data sets, maybe from electronic health records, data from smartphone apps tracking mood and behavior, information from wearable sensors measuring sleep or activity levels, AI algorithms could potentially identify subtle patterns, predict crises, or stratify patients in ways far beyond human capacity alone.
So AI could find different flavors of depression based on network structure.
Exactly. Identifying distinct subtypes of depression based on unique network configurations, not just symptom counts. Or, crucially, predicting suicidal crises by recognizing ominous convergences of specific factors, maybe increased network instability plus social isolation plus sleep disruption detected in real-time data streams.
And this could feed into clinical tools.
That's the vision. We might soon have clinical decision support systems that take a patient's specific, dynamically updated network profile and output highly personalized risk assessments or tailored treatment recommendations right there for the clinician and patient to discuss.
Wow. Okay, AI integration, what's another future direction?
Mathematical modeling and theoretical advances. Embracing a systems paradigm naturally invites much deeper cross-pollination with fields like physics, mathematics, and engineering.
Bringing in different kinds of thinking.
Absolutely. We can expect much more sophisticated computational models that truly capture the nonlinear dynamics of these symptom networks, how they shift, stabilize, and sometimes abruptly transition between states.
Like the attractor concept.
Exactly, but modeled with much more mathematical rigor. There's pioneering work, for instance, by Carl Friston and others on computational nosology, applying fundamental principles like the brain's tendency to minimize free energy or prediction error to redefine how we even conceptualize disorders, moving beyond static descriptions towards dynamic processes of maladaptive inference or belief updating.
That sounds quite abstract, powerful.
It is abstract, but these models can generate very specific testable predictions. They can show mathematically how strengthening just one particular connection in a network, like the link between rumination and a negative core belief about oneself, might sharply increase the probability of the entire system getting stuck in a depressed state. The ultimate goal is perhaps a unifying, multi-scale network understanding of mental illness, connecting processes all the way from molecular interactions up to complex thoughts and social behaviors.
A grand unified theory of psychopathology, maybe.
Well, that might be ambitious, but certainly a more integrated process-based understanding.
Okay, theory and modeling. How about assessment? How might diagnosis change?
Personalized network-based assessment and diagnosis. In the future, a standard mental health evaluation might go far beyond just checking off DSM criteria from a single interview. It could routinely include constructing a personalized symptom network for each patient. This might involve using digital tools like specialized smartphone apps to gather intensive longitudinal data tracking mood, thoughts, behaviors, sleep, context over a period of time.
So you get a dynamic picture.
Exactly. The result wouldn't be just a label, but maybe an ideographic network diagram, a map showing that individual's unique pattern of symptom interactions.
And clinicians could use this map with the patient.
That's the idea. A clinician could sit down with a patient, look at their personalized network map, and say something like, okay, look, here we can see from your data over the last 2 weeks that spikes in work stress tend to be followed within a few hours by increased rumination, which then seems to strongly predict difficulty sleeping that night. That particular stress rumination sleep loop looks like a really key maintenance factor for you right now.
That sounds incredibly collaborative and empowering for the patient.
It really does. It not only pinpoints precise targets for intervention, but also helps the patient understand their own dynamics in a much deeper way. They become active participants in mapping and modifying their own system.
Okay, so better assessment leads to better intervention.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
That's the fourth direction. Adaptive, network-informed interventions. The real endgame here is a new kind of adaptive personalized treatment. If we can measure a patient's network state in near real time,
Using those apps and sensors.
right, then interventions can potentially adjust dynamically based on that real-time information.
Give me an example.
Imagine a sophisticated therapy chatbot or a digital mental health app. It could detect, based on user input or sensor data, when certain subnetworks say anxiety-related thought loops or avoidance behaviors are starting to flare up for that individual.
And it could intervene right then.
Proactively, yes. It could deliver a brief, targeted intervention precisely when it's needed most. Maybe a quick grounding exercise, a cognitive reframing prompt tailored to their specific negative thought pattern, or encouragement to engage in a planned alternative behavior.
Just-in-time support.
Exactly. Or consider smart medication dosing systems. Maybe for some conditions, medication levels could be subtly adjusted based on network indicators, perhaps increasing an anti-anxiety medication slightly when the anxiety network shows signs of ramping up, as detected via wearables and self-report, then decreasing it as the network stabilizes.
That sounds futuristic, but plausible.
It's complex, ethically and practically, but it's the direction things could move. Therapists could also use network feedback during sessions to discuss specific patterns observed since the last meeting, helping the patient gain insight and refine coping strategies. This vision is sometimes called closed-loop care, a tight integration of ongoing assessment and dynamically adjusted intervention, aiming to address issues before they snowball into full episodes.
Closed-loop care. I like that. And finally,
leveraging transdiagnostic and dimensional approaches. The network paradigm dovetails beautifully with the broader move in mental health towards transdiagnostic treatments, interventions that target core processes that cut across traditional disorder boundaries.
processes like rumination or emotion dysregulation.
Exactly. As network research identifies common subnetworks, or particularly influential nodes that are relevant across many different diagnoses, we can develop and refine interventions specifically aimed at those core dimensions.
So less focus on the specific DSM label.
Yes. For example, cognitive training designed to reduce a specific bias, like jumping to conclusions, might be beneficial for anyone whose personalized network analysis shows that this cognitive bias is a central driver of their distress, regardless of whether their primary diagnosis is anxiety, psychosis, depression, or something else.
Which could lead to more modular therapy.
Precisely. You could envision a future where a patient's treatment plan is precisely constructed from evidence-based modules, each targeting a specific keynote or connection identified in their unique network map. It's the ultimate personalization, building the treatment to fit the person's dynamic system, not trying to fit the person into a predefined treatment package based on a broad label.
Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive has really shown us how this network systems model offers a rigorous and philosophically quite different way of reimagining mental illness.
Yeah, moving away from static entities.
Right. Portraying disorders not as these fixed things you either have or don't, but as complex, dynamic patterns that emerge from all these interacting elements within a person's unique biological, psychological, and social system.
And it's crucial to emphasize this shift from fixed categories to dynamic networks is far more than just some, abstract theoretical tweak.
Right, it has real-world consequences.
Profound practical ramifications for how we diagnose, how we develop and deliver treatments, how we predict risk, and even how we talk about mental health and hopefully reduce that deeply ingrained stigma.
Because viewing symptoms as part of a causal system rather than just items on a checklist.
It gives us powerful new conceptual tools to intervene more intelligently by targeting key leverage points, tools to potentially predict crises before they fully unfold, and maybe most importantly, tools to treat people as unique individuals with changeable patterns, not just as carriers of a lifelong label.
Now, of course, no model is perfect, right? No panacea. And the network approach certainly faces its own challenges, methodological complexities, needing more research, figuring out clinical implementation.
Absolutely. It's still evolving.
But as a guiding framework, it feels undeniably like a significant leap forward conceptually. It seems to smartly avoid those logical traps of reification and circularity we talked about earlier by focusing directly on observable interactions and dynamics.
And You know, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it feels like it aligns psychiatry much more closely with the true, astonishing complexity of the human mind and brain. We are complex systems. The coming years will certainly be crucial for testing its full implementation and refining the methods. But if the old paradigm, the categorical model, is clearly straining under the weight of evidence and struggling to meet clinical needs effectively,
Then the network model offers a really compelling, data-driven, and theoretically richer alternative.
I think that's a fair summary, yes.
We seem to be moving, maybe slowly, but moving towards a future where diagnoses could be more precise and personalized, where treatments are targeted and dynamic, adapting to the individual over time, and where patients are understood in the fullness of their lived experience as complex, adaptable systems, not just collections of symptoms to be checked off a list.
That's the hope, a more dynamic, personalized, and ultimately more effective approach to mental health care.
So, thinking about everything we've discussed, what stands out to you, our listeners, as the most impactful, maybe the most exciting shift this new network model could bring to mental health care? We hope this deep dive has helped you feel more informed and maybe genuinely intrigued by this evolving landscape of psychiatric understanding.